The foreman set her trunk back on the wagon bed before she had both boots on the ground. Norah Sutton stood in the ranch yard with the morning cold still caught in her skirts and watched him do it, the way a person watches weather she cannot argue with. She was 29 years old, a widow, and she had come 400 miles on the strength of one letter to keep the books of a man she had never met. "There has been a mistake," the foreman said. He was a lean man with a gray mustache and a voice gone flat from years of giving orders to animals. "Mr. Crane sent for a bookkeeper. We figured on a man." Behind him, 3 hands had stopped their work at the corral to watch, hung over the top rail the way men hang when they expect to be entertained. One of them spat into the dust. Norah did not step toward the wagon, and she did not step back from it. She laid her gloved hand flat on the lid of the trunk her father had carried west before her, and she kept her chin exactly where it was. The wind crossed the open yard and carried wood smoke and cattle and the first hard edge of autumn. What the foreman did not know, what none of the men watching knew, was that this plain woman in her traveling wool would open one of those dust-covered ledgers inside the week and find, written in the hand of a woman already in her grave, the one thing that could save this ranch and the silent man who owned it. If this story is reaching your heart already, take a moment to tap that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from today. And if a woman in your own family once came west with nothing and built a home out of it, leave her name for me below. I read every single one. The man who owned the place came out of the barn while the foreman was still deciding what to do with her. Silas Crane was tall and worn down near to the bone, somewhere past 40, with a beard he had stopped tending and eyes that had the look of a window with the curtains drawn. He did not greet her. He looked at the trunk, and he looked at the woman standing beside it in her good gray dress, and something moved over his face that was too tired to be called anger. "Pike," he said to the foreman. His voice came out rough, as though he kept in a drawer and only took it out when he had to. "Leave it where it is." Then he turned and went back into the barn, and that was the whole of their first meeting. Ezra Pike carried the trunk inside with poor grace and dropped it in a narrow room off the kitchen, a room with a desk, a cold iron stove, and a shelf of ledgers furred gray with dust. "Office," he said, and left her standing in it. Norah drew off her gloves and let herself feel, for the length of one breath, how far the road had carried her. Her father, Amos Sutton, had kept a dry goods store in a town west of Chicago, and when her mother went into the ground with diphtheria the winter Norah turned 11, it was Norah who took up the account book, because her father's hands shook too hard with grieving to make the figures come right. She had been keeping books ever since. She knew double entry the way other girls knew their catechism, and she was better at it than any man her father ever hired. At 20, she married a railway clerk named Daniel, a careful and gentle man who died of a burst appendix 2 springs back before they were given any children. After the doctor's bill and the burying, there was not money enough to hold the store, and it was sold to settle what was owed. A woman of 9 and 20 with no husband, no father, and no fortune had 2 roads open to her, and Norah had no wish to spend her life bent over other people's washtubs. So when she saw the notice in the Chicago paper, a Montana cattleman seeking a person of good character and skill in accounts, she wrote that same evening in her finest hand and signed herself Sutton, and let the man make of it what he would. He hired her back by post. He had not asked, and she had not lied. That first night, the cook set a plate in front of her without much warmth and waited to see what she was made of. Hetty Doss had fed the Crane outfit for 9 years and had buried a husband of her own, and she did not waste kindness on people who would not last the week. Norah thanked her by name, washed her own plate and cup after, and asked whether she might carry the scraps out to the yellow ranch dog that had been watching her from the doorway with its ears laid flat. Something shifted at the corner of Hetty's mouth. "Most don't think to ask," she said, and pushed the scrap bowl an inch nearer. It was the first warm word anyone had given Norah since the stage set her down at Miles Bend. The mockery began in earnest the next morning, and it did not let up. The hands had 100 small ways of letting a woman know what they thought of her at the ledger desk. They set a milking stool outside the office door, so she would have something her own size to sit on. They asked her, hats in their hands and their faces grave as deacons, whether she would want her sums done up in pink ink. The youngest of them, a boy named Toomey who could not have been 20, took to standing in the office doorway of an evening with 2 or 3 of the others behind him, asking her loud questions about figures he did not understand, hoping to catch her out in front of an audience. Norah answered each one plain and short and correct, and went back to her column. And after a week of being made to look the fool by his own questions, Toomey stopped coming. By then, the yellow dog had taken to lying across the office threshold, and the hands had to step over it to do their mocking, which took some of the grand feeling out of the thing. Ezra Pike was the worst of them, and the hard part of his cruelty was that it never raised its voice. He would lean in the office doorway and explain to her, in the patient tone of a man stating the plain truth, that she was burning good lamp oil over a dead thing. The ranch was finished, he said, and anyone with eyes could see it. The bank at Miles Bend held the note. The payment fell due the 1st of October, $240 that Silas Crane did not have and could not raise, and when the first came around, Mr. Alcott would take the land and the cattle and the house, and that would be the end of the Crane outfit. Wasn't always so, Pike said once, and for half a breath the meanness drained out of him and left something close to sorrow. Mrs. Crane kept the whole of it running. Then she passed, and it came apart, and there's no figuring on this earth can mend a dead thing. He looked at the row of dusty ledgers the way a man looks at headstones. Then he remembered himself, and the meanness came back into his face, and he told her she had a week before he would drive her to the depot with his own hands. Norah learned the rest of it from Hetty, in pieces, over the cold suppers. Margaret Crane had died 14 months back, in the spring, after a winter so hard it killed half the herd and most of the hope on the place. The fever took her in 4 days. The town lay 9 miles off over Bad Road, and by the time the doctor reached the house, she was already going from them. Silas Crane had not been the same man since. He worked from dark to dark. He held the cattle alive by the strength of his 2 hands, and he did not speak unless speaking could not be got around. He had not so much as lifted the cover of the account books in all those months, because the books were where Margaret still lived, in her small upright hand, and he could not look at her writing and bear knowing she would not come back to finish the line. He believed, Hetty told her, glancing at the door, though no one was near it, that it was the want that had killed his wife, that the long worry over money had worn Margaret thin until the fever found an open door, that a better provider, a wiser man, would have a living wife asleep upstairs. He carried it the way another man might carry a ruined leg, and it had bent him most of the way to the ground. On the 3rd night, late, Silas came to the office door. Norah did not hear him until he was already there, filling the frame, a lamp in his hand throwing his shadow long across the floor. She had Margaret's first ledger open in front of her and her own working pages spread around it, and she had been at it so long the figures swam. He looked at the open book for a long while and said nothing. His jaw worked once. "You can read her hand," he said at last. It was not quite a question. "She wrote a clear hand," Norah answered. "Clearer than most men. I have kept books behind." Silas Crane stood there a moment more with the lamplight shaking a little in his grip. Then he said, "Don't tear anything out," and the words came rough and low, and Norah understood that he was not talking about paper. "I won't tear out a single page," she told him. He nodded once and was gone, and she heard his boots go up the stairs slow as an old man's. She lit the lamp before dawn each day and worked until her eyes gave out at night. The hand inside that first ledger was small and upright and certain, and within a page Norah knew she was looking at the work of a careful woman. Margaret Crane had kept good books, better than good. She had kept them the way Amos Sutton had taught his daughter to keep them, every figure squared, every account standing straight as a run of fence posts, the cattle tallies and the feed and the wages and the store credit all in their proper columns. Then on a date in the early spring of the year before, in the middle of a line, the hand simply stopped. The rest of the page was white. The rest of the book was white. Norah sat with her finger beneath that last unfinished figure for a long moment and understood the things Silas Crane could not make himself look at. Here was the page where a living woman had laid down her pen, meaning to take it up again after the supper dishes, and had not. She built the whole of the ranch's affairs back up out of Margaret's records, and the loose papers crammed in the desk, and the receipts spiked on a nail beside the door. The picture that came together told a different story than the one Ezra Pike painted, and a kinder one than the stone Silas Crane carried. There was the note held by the bank, true enough, and the payment of $240 due the 1st of October. But the balance standing against the ranch was small, far smaller than Silas believed, because Margaret had been paying it down faster than her husband ever knew. She had sold her eggs and her butter and the quilts she pieced through the long, dark winters. She had traded calves with a sharpness that would have done a seasoned stockman proud, and she had been setting the money by, a little at a time, against the note, the way a careful woman sets aside seed for spring. There was a thing that happened to Norah over those long days at the desk, bent above another woman's careful hand. She came to know Margaret Crane. She knew her by the neat downstroke of her figures and by the small notes she had left herself in the margins, a reminder to dock a hand for a broken harness, a line to set cream aside for a sick neighbor. She knew the winters had gone hard on her by the way the numbers drew tight in the cold months and opened again come spring. She knew Margaret had loved this place and had loved the work of holding it together, the way Norah's own mother had once loved the ledger of the store. Two women she would never meet had taught her the same plain truth, that the keeping of a careful book is its own kind of love, set down where it will last. It was on the 5th day that Mr. Alcott rode out from Miles Bend. He was a soft, well-fed man in a town coat, and he came not because he had business that could not wait, but because it pleased him to remind Silas Crane of what was coming. He found them in the yard, Silas and Pike and Norah, and he spoke to Silas as a man speaks to a debtor he has already buried. 1st of October, Crane, he said, sitting his good horse and looking down at all of them. 240 in coin, where the paper comes due and the bank takes its own. I would not want you to be surprised. His eye fell on Norah then, and a thin smile came onto his face. And this would be the lady bookkeeper I have heard about. Well, I suppose a man may as well have his accounts tidy when he loses them. Pike laughed at that, short and ugly. Silas Crane said nothing at all, only stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground, a man waiting on a sentence already passed. Norah looked up at the banker on his fine horse and did not drop her gaze, and she said in an even voice, "We will be ready for you on the 1st, Mr. Alcott." Alcott chuckled as though she had said something charming, and turned his horse, and rode back toward town, well pleased with his morning. That same night Norah found it, tucked behind the last full ledger, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone soft with handling, was a second book, smaller than the first, no bigger than a prayer book. She unwound the cloth by lamplight and opened the cover, and what she read on the first page made her set the book down and press both hands flat against the desk to keep them steady. If you are still with us here on this porch, do this story a kindness. Tap subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories do not get told unless you help us tell them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments, and let them know we tell these the way they were meant to be told. The little book was Margaret's own, kept in her own private way, and it was a ledger of her life rather than the ranch. Down the left side, she had set the small money she earned with her own hands, the eggs and the butter and the quilts and the traded calves, every coin of it. Down the right side, she had written what each coin was meant for, and it was there in that second column that Margaret Crane was still living. Porch roof before the snow, one line read. Silas a new coat, the brown one wore through at the elbow. Doctor money, kept by, in case the cough comes back in the cold. School in town for the child when the child comes. A piece of glass for the south window, so the kitchen catches the morning. Seed corn, the good kind, come April. Each line was a small plain wish, and reading them was like hearing a voice through a wall, near enough to know and too far off to answer. She had been building a future on that ranch one egg at a time, and she had told no one, least of all her husband, because Silas Crane was a proud man who would not touch his wife's egg money, and she meant to surprise him with what she had saved when the note was paid. Near the back of the book, Norah found the last entry. The figures stopped where the fever stopped them in the early spring, and beside the final sum Margaret had written, in that small upright hand, a single line that was not about money at all. Tell Silas it was never the ranch I came west for. Norah sat a long while with the lamp guttering and that line in front of her, and then she did the work she had been hired to do. She added it all. The reserve Margaret had set by. The tin of coin Hetty helped her find at last beneath a loose board in the pantry, where Margaret had always kept it, came to better than $200. And there was more than that. Among the receipts spiked on the nail by the door, in Margaret's careful keeping, Norah found a bank receipt dated the autumn before Margaret died, a payment of $60 made against the note and stamped by Alcott's own clerk. She checked it against the bank's running figure that Alcott had read out so grandly in the yard, and the $60 was not there. It had never been credited. The bank had taken Margaret's payment and lost it in their own books, or pocketed it, and for 14 months the note had stood $60 heavier than it had any right to stand, and Silas Crane, who would not open the books, had never known. Between the reserve and the $60 the bank owed back, the ranch was able to make the October payment and stand near clear of debt besides. The thing that had bent Silas Crane to the ground for 14 months, the belief that one had killed his wife and that he had failed her, was a lie the bank had helped to tell. Margaret had managed it. Margaret had it almost won. She had only set down her pen too soon. The 1st of October came up cold and bright, with frost silvering the corral rails. Alcott rode out from Miles Bend in his town coat, and he did not come alone. He brought his clerk and 2 men from the town to witness the taking, the way a man brings an audience to a thing he expects to enjoy. Word had gone around, the way it does, and the hands had drifted in from their work and stood along the corral, and Hetty stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, and Ezra Pike stood near the porch with the look of a man at a funeral he had predicted. Silas Crane came out of the house and stood on his own porch step with his hat in his hands, and he was a man who had already given up. Alcott swung down, unhurried, and drew the note from his coat. "Well, Crane," he said, "the first has come. I don't suppose anything has changed." Then Norah Sutton came out through the kitchen door, and she set a table out on the porch, a plain pine table, and on it she laid the ledgers, open. She set down the receipt for the $60 beside them, and she set down the tin of Margaret's coin and a leather poke besides, and she counted out $240 in good money in front of every soul in that yard, stacking the coins in the cold sunlight while no one made a sound. "The payment, Mr. Alcott," she said. $240, in coin, as the note requires. You want to count it." Alcott's smile had gone stiff. He looked at the money, and he looked at her. "Now see here," he began, but Norah had already laid her finger on the receipt. "And this," she said, in the same even voice, loud enough to carry to the corral, "is a payment of $60 made against this note last autumn, stamped by your own clerk's hand, that was never credited to Mr. Crane's account. The note has stood $60 too high for 14 months. I expect the bank will want to make that right today, in front of these witnesses, before it takes another payment from anyone." The clerk had gone white. Alcott's mouth opened and shut. He took up the receipt with a hand that was not quite steady, and he looked at the stamp, his own bank stamp, and there was nothing in the wide, bright morning that he could say. For a moment no one moved. Then one of the hands at the corral took off his hat, slow, and turned it in his fingers, and another did the same, and the small motion went down the rail like wind through grass. Ezra Pike stood with his jaw working and his face gone red, looking at the open ledgers and the stacked coin and the woman he had promised to drive to the depot, and he found he had nothing left to say. One of the townsmen Alcott had brought to witness the taking cleared his throat and said, "To no one and to everyone, seems the lady's got the better of the arithmetic." Hetty, in the doorway, let out a breath that was almost a laugh and pressed her apron to her eyes. Alcott counted the $240 because there was nothing else left for him to do, and he wrote out the receipt with the note, now $60 lighter. And he did it on Silas Crane's own porch with his audience watching. And when it was done, he climbed onto his fine horse a smaller man than he had got down. The yard began to empty. Norah gathered the ledgers off the pine table, all but the smallest one. That one she carried to where Silas Crane still stood on the porch step, a man who had come out to lose everything and did not yet seem to understand that he had not. She put the little oilcloth book into his hands. She kept this. "It is her own, set apart from the ranch books," Norah said. "She paid the note down with her own egg money, year on year, and never told you, because she meant to surprise you when it was clear." Silas Crane looked down at the small book in his rough hands as though it might burn him. He opened it. Norah saw his eyes go down the right-hand column, the porch roof and the brown coat and the doctor money and the school for the child when the child came, and she saw the moment he reached the last line, the one that was not about money. His shoulders, which had been bent for 14 months, began to shake. He made no sound. The tears ran down into his ruined beard, and he did not wipe them. And he stood on his own porch in the cold reading his wife's hand, and for the first time the reading did not break him. He read that she had not blamed him. He read that she had managed it and had been happy in the building of it. When at last he lifted his head, his voice when it came was wrecked and low, but it carried across the still yard to Pike in the hands and to Hetty in the door. "She stays," Silas Crane said. He was looking at Norah. "Long as she will have the work. She stays." Ezra Pike came to her 2 days after, turning his hat in his hands at the office door, and he was not a man made for apologizing, and it cost him to do it. "I said some things," he started, and could not seem to get further. "You said them because you loved the place and you thought it was dying," Norah told him. "A man who fights for a dying thing is not the worst kind of man." She let him keep his place, and his pride along with it, because driving a proud man into the road had never once squared an account. As for the bank, she might have made an ugly noise about the $60 in every town from Miles Bend to Helena, and Alcott knew it and waited on it. She did not. She wrote the bank a plain letter laying out the error and asking it set right, and kept the matter between herself and Alcott and the men who had stood as witnesses in the yard, and the $60 came back the next week with a stiff note of regret. Alcott never crossed the Crane land again, and that was consequence enough. There was a kindness returned to her as well, small and unlooked for. An old freighter passing through recognized the name Sutton, and it turned out he had bought goods from her father's store outside Chicago 20 years before, and he sat at Hetty's table and told Silas Crane that Amos Sutton had been the most honest merchant he ever traded with, and that his daughter would have come by her straight figures honest. Silas listened to all of it and said little, but he listened. The ranch came through the winter solvent. The note all but cleared. The herd built carefully back up out of Margaret's old tallies and Norah's new ones. The hands stopped setting the milking stool by the door. They began, instead, to bring her their own small troubles with money, a wage figured wrong, a letter from home they could not make out, and she helped them, and the office stopped being a thing they laughed at. Spring came on slow, and then all at once, the way it does in that country, the snow going off the south slopes first, and the creek running high and brown with the meld of it. The herd dropped its calves, and the tallies in the new ledger ran black for the first time in 2 years. Word of what had passed in the Crane yard on the 1st of October had gone all down the valley by then, and it changed things in small ways. Women who had once crossed the road to keep clear of the lady bookkeeper now stopped at the gate with a basket and a question about their own household sums. A rancher 2 valleys over wrote to ask would she set his book straight for a fee, and then another wrote, and Norah found she had work of her own and a name in the country that was hers, not her father's and not her husband's, but her own. Silas Crane began to speak again, a sentence at a time, the way a creek comes back after a long dry spell. He kept Margaret's little book on the office shelf beside the ledgers, in the open now, out of its oilcloth, because Norah had shown him that what his wife had made with love deserved a place on the shelf, kept and read, instead of buried away. On a still evening near the end of that first winter, with the lamp lit in the office window and the snow coming soft across the yard, Silas Crane stopped in the doorway on his way up to bed. He stood there a while in his quiet way, watching her square the last column of the day. "Margaret would have liked you," he said, and then, after a moment, having never once called her anything but Mrs. Sutton, he said her given name, careful, as though he were setting down a coin he did not want to drop. "Norah, there's no need to go, come spring, if you have a mind to stay." Norah set down her pen. Outside the snow kept falling, and the lamp burned steady in the window, and on the shelf above the desk the 2 ledgers stood side by side, the dead woman's and the living one's, and the home that had been coming apart was whole again, the account squared, every figure in its place. "I have a mind to stay," she said, and she took up her pen and finished the line. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its last word. If it moved you, the next one is already waiting there on your screen, so go on and give it a watch. And if you have not yet, tap subscribe and pull up a chair here on the porch, where we tell the stories of women who carried far more than the world ever bothered to see. I will see you in the next one.